This particular panel is about narrative and television. We have two speakers who are engaging with questions of narrative in different ways. Again, as always, we take the two papers in one go and then questions to the end. The first speaker is Anthony Smith from Salford University. If you haven't read his book, Storytelling Industries yet, please do so now. Go out and buy it, basically. It's that good. Yes.
Thank you.
And yes, so basically, he's already written a whole book on how narrative operates in different industrial settings, and he's going to continue with that work today by looking in particular at how episodes continue to remain important in serialized times.
Yep. Very well summed up. That's great. Hello. Right. So yes, I've got to be honest. I do want to issue a disclaimer at the front, at the start. I'm not really connecting very well to the conference theme here, so my apologies. This is really about me presenting a narrative model. So warning. I will say that I could comment on how what I'm talking about today, how it relates to issues of taste and class in television, because I think it does. But again, apologies, that bit's not in the paper. But you could ask me questions about that if that sounds like something you want to discuss. That said, enough. Let's begin. So, my paper is That Was a Good Episode, examining the narrative properties of episodicity in US television drama in the post-network era. For this paper, I'm going to identify and discuss what I term as episodicity in television drama narrative. I'll be looking in particular at contemporary American television drama, but the ideas I discuss here, I do think they are applicable more widely. What do I mean by episodicity? In a nutshell, I mean it is the practice of conceptualizing, crafting, promoting, disseminating, and or perceiving drama episodes as distinct narrative units. So it's the different ways in which the episode is understood as a really meaningful and important narrative unit. And I would say that these practices of episodicity are significant historically, but also widespread today as well. And so, with this paper, I'm going to introduce my properties of episodicity model to show how this practice operates. And as I say, I'm going to be looking in particular at contemporary American television. Why does any of this matter? Well, because this idea of episodicity, it complicates ideas around television narrative, and particularly ideas regarding serialized storytelling within television studies. Talk about the academic context around serialized storytelling, but I'm first very quickly going to give an incredibly general historical context to talk about type of trend that academics have been responding to over about 4+ decades. So, very generally, in American television, from the late 1970s to early 1980s, if we put to one side daytime soap opera, serialization in American television drama, scarce at that time, and there has been a trajectory since then from serialized television to become, as it is today, ubiquitous in American television drama. And this is due to a whole range of complex institutional, technological, wider cultural changes that academics have discussed. And as many of you will know, many, but not all, but many American television dramas are entirely serialized today. Now, academics have responded to this big general trend, and I'm talking about academics writing from the 1980s, 90s, noughties, and in the past 15 years. I would say, again, really generalising, I think there's been two tendencies that I want to think about that have occurred during this time. One has been to examine television drama narrative chiefly based on its seriality and to emphasise the significance of seriality. And related to that, see a practice of scholars conceptualising dramas and defining dramas in relation to their seriality. And I've put these book covers on here because this is just four of many academic books that discuss their objects of study as contemporary serial television, complex serial television. I've included 4 here, but there's many more and you will have seen them. There is a second related tendency as well. And that is, as a long-standing practice, essentially structuring a binary between serialized storytelling and episodic storytelling. And I bet that all of you are very familiar with this binary. Within this binary, episodic storytelling functions as an antonym of serialization. So episodic storytelling, generally understood as the designing of storylines that begin and end with a single episode, and that's in stark contrast to serialized storytelling, that is stories told over multiple episodes. And even with, as scholars over decades have noticed, from Robin Nelson, Michael Hammond and Lucy Masden and Jason Mattel, even with there's a very well, it's very well understood that many episodes can contain both episodic storytelling or serialized storytelling, and whether you dub that flexi-narrative or the series serial hybrid or Mattel's narrative complexity, that binary is still in operation. It's the idea, well, this part of the episode is episodic and this part of the episode is serialized. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong, I want to be clear, with what academics, the academics have been wrong to have this tendency because, as I said, you're responding to the shift of the growing prevalence of serialized storytelling in television drama. I think these, these academic interventions have been really important, but I do think that what's happening is that within these academic contexts, the episode as a narrative unit is undervalued and underexplored. When talking about serialized drama in particular, you see it at an industrial level, which I'm not going to go into today, but you do see it at an academic level as well. These episodes are sometimes, by implication, seem to be just mere vehicles for the delivery of serial narrative. But I think this doesn't reflect how many serialized television narratives operate at a textual level or culturally. And what I'm contending here is that forms of episodicity persist even in, I'll come to explain more about what I mean by this, even in entirely serialized dramas. So what I'm suggesting is we need to rethink ideas around the episode's narrative unit, the idea of what episodic storytelling even means, and how episodes function in contemporary serialized television narratives. Oh, okay. Ta-da! So this is this theoretical framework that I have put together to help us understand how episodicity works in contemporary serial narratives. So I've designed this model to identify and understand how episodicity works. And what I'm suggesting is that there are narrative properties at a textual level that activate ideas of episodicity. Let's see, narrative properties up here, but there are also industrial properties at play that can give rise to or activate episodicity. So, for example, the releasing of episodes on a weekly basis, as opposed to releasing an entire season at once, can certainly encourage us as viewers to conceptualise the narrative unit of the episode more as its own, meaningful narrative unit. And also say that there are participatory properties in play. So I'm talking about how episodicity can be activated through public discourses in journalism, across social media. So an obvious example would be the publishing of episode recaps by journalists or fans. Help you to think more about the episode as a meaningful narrative unit. So what I'm suggesting is, by this model, episodicity is activated via these three categories. I'm only going to focus on one category today, which is this narrative properties element. So, what comes under that heading of narrative properties? What I'm saying is that there are narrative characteristics, so operate at a textual level, that can distinguish an episode as a meaningful narrative unit in its own right. These categories are, and I'm going to go through each of these one by one: story discreteness, character perspective, story location, genre, aesthetic approach, narrative ellipses, and episode plot structure. So I'm going to take each of these in turn, and I think time will permit. So the first narrative property that I want to talk about that gives rise to episodicity is story discreteness. So this is an episode is distinguished by its inclusion of a distinct storyline. Standalone stories, case of the week, crime of the week, monster of the week, and really, at a basic level, the introduction and resolution of a conflict within a single episode. The one example I'm just going to briefly talk about is a Poker Face, a Peacock drama starring Natasha Lyonne. So it's a detective drama that self-consciously adopts the traditional case of the week model, appears to be paying homage to Columbo in particular, as far as I can tell, and it's it's very self-consciously conventional, traditional, episodic storytelling, as the term is typically understood. Now, this use of standalone stories is how episodic storytelling is typically defined, and it still matters. However, the kind of more non-intuitive thing I'm saying today is there are other narrative characteristics that can contribute to episodicity. So firstly, character perspective. So episodicity can emerge through an episode's distinctive approach to character perspective, such as the restricting, an unusual restricting of character perspective in an episode, which is something HBO's Leftovers would occasionally do, or the use of atypical perspectives. So, for example, showing the perspectives of characters that we don't usually see the perspectives of. I just want to briefly talk about one example of restricting perspective, and that is House of the Dragon. The final 2 episodes of the first season of this drama is each highly distinctive in terms of how they restrict character perspective. So as the season approaches its conclusion, Queen Alicent and Princess Rhaenyra, the two lead characters of the series, are in conflict. Now, in the penultimate episode of the season, the narrative perspective is largely confined to Alicent on the left there, and those around her in King's Landing. Conversely, in the final episode of the season, the Black Queen, the narrative perspective is largely restricted to Rhaenyra and her people. So through this narrative device, these episodes are highly distinctive in relation to each other. Episodicity can also occur through an episode's situation of characters in a distinctive environment. So in the case of The Last of Us, this is a drama with a very picaresque narrative when Joel and Ellie, pictured there, are involved in various exploits as they travel post-apocalyptic America. Many of the episodes, which draw on high production values and the source game's celebrated environmental design, are each distinguished due to them taking place in a distinct, visually distinct location. So examples would include the spectacular ruined cityscape of Boston in the second episode, Infected, the abandoned shopping mall in the seventh episode, Left Behind, and the wintry rural environs of the eighth episode, When We Are in Need. Episodicity can also occur from an episode's distinct activation of genre. So in the case of The Mandalorian, echoing the first Star Wars film, it frequently draws on the Western, the samurai, and the space opera genres. However, the episode The Passenger from season 2 is distinctive due to its activation of the sci-fi horror genre. Basically, in this episode, lots of baby ice spiders chase Mando, and then he confronts, as pictured, their colossal parent. And this scenario frequently recalls the Alien film franchise. Episodicity can also arise through when an episode is visually or hourly distinct due to its irregular aesthetic approach. For example, when an episode has distinctive aspects of mise-en-scène or sound design. And a simple example of that is Netflix's The Haunting of Hill House. Famously, its Two Storms episode makes extensive use of lengthy, continuous shots, making the episode stylistically distinct. Episodicity, a bit like aesthetic approach, episodicity can also be activated through distinctive plotting style. So, for example, an episode's use of an atypical plot structure, or say its use of thematic parallelism between distinct storylines. So, for example, if you've got an entirely serialized set of storylines in an episode, they're all ongoing, and yet in the episode itself, by plotting the different storylines together, can make an episode-specific meaning. Would be an example of that. I'm going to give a specific example of an atypical plot structure with HBO's superhero drama The Watchmen. So there's an episode from this season called A God Walks Into a Bar. And this episode is framed around the superhero Dr. Manhattan. We can see the back of his blue head there, meeting Angela Abar, Regina King in the picture. They meet him for the first time, and the plot structure of this episode is unique, highly fragmented and discontinuous. It's highly distracting and confusing. It's designed to reflect how the superhero, Dr. Manhattan, experiences all time, simultaneously, all of the time. So in the episode, he's meeting this lady for the first time and saying, you know, it sounds like a really corny pickup line that, hey, we're already together. Anyway, but this episode is an example of how an episode has been discussed, celebrated as an episode in its own right, for how it uses a unique plot structure to share the perspective of a unique character, certainly an unusual character. Finally, bit related, well, still related to plot, but episodicity can occur by narrative ellipses. So this is when an episode is made distinct due to its story time, the time in the world of the story, being bracketed by narrative ellipses. So back to the House of the Dragon again. If we look in the second episode of season 1, The Rogue Prince, it takes place 6 months after the events that included the opening episode, whereas the third episode is focused on events that take place 3 years after this second episode. So therefore, The Rogue Prince, as an episode, the events it depicts are highly distinguished due to it being kind of bracketed or buffeted by this story time that is not presented to us. So back to this model, these different narrative properties that we've been looking at. The main argument I'm trying to make here is they work to present episodes as distinctive narrative units, rather than, as episodes seem to be referred to these days, or as is implied, rather than mere arbitrary chunks of serialized story. There is meaning to, episodes are constructed to be thought of as distinct, meaningful units. So in combination with the industrial practices and participatory properties, all these properties work together to establish a given episode's degree of episodicity. And I'm thinking it like a sliding scale. You might say some program, well, it's ticking a lot of these properties, therefore it's high in episodicity. I'd say The Mandalorian, whereas another program might be lower on the scale, like Netflix's Haunting on Hill House. So, to sum up, this properties of episodicity model, I'm suggesting, can replace the episodic serial binary. So instead of that binary, we can see all episodes of contemporary serialized dramas, regardless of whether they have standalone stories or not. We can say they have varying degrees of episodicity. Well, why would we do this? Well, I think it's useful, especially useful today, in an era when, particularly with US television drama, is so ubiquitously serialized. I think with a lot of television, I don't know how useful the old series binary is today. So, I would also say, I just want to finish up by saying that by showing how episodicity and the idea of thinking of the episode as a meaningful narrative unit might still matters today. It shows how, in an online TV era, in an era of complex serial narrative, it shows how contemporary television is drawing on the medium's traditions of episodic narrative. So yes, contemporary television drama today draws on its traditions with seriality, which after all emerges from the models of serial narrative that broadcast soap opera establish, but also through its continuing use of episodicity. Thank you very much.
We're handing over to Louise. Louise recently completed her PhD at the University of Birmingham PhD in order to take it out there.
Yeah, thank you, Elsa. Yeah, so this model originates in my PhD thesis. I didn't set out to create a model initially. I just set out to explore representation in serial narratives. And it touches on a lot of the arguments that I've seen in panels today and different ideas that people have. I've always been interested in representation all the way through my academic career, largely as a result of the importance of characters in ensuring continuity, presenting a realness and nowness, how that appeals to audiences, how it speaks to the narrative itself, and also in relation to Richard Dyer's Matter of Images. I remember reading that as an undergrad. So how we are seen determines in part how we are treated, how we treat others is based on how we see them, and such seeing comes from representation. So in relation to that, seeing on television begins with visibility, so who we can see on screen as opposed to off there. How they are represented, whether they're categorised, how they're labelled, whether they're an archetype, a stereotype, whether they push through those boundaries and binaries. Traditional television programming has generally maintained binary identities. Not so much anymore, obviously, but you look back at the 80s, the 90s, a lot of the characters that you saw on screen could fit into specific boxes. But obviously, with seriality, with the development of television, has come progressive and complex representation. So you have more nuanced representation, largely through the possibilities that the complexity of television offers. I'm not going to debate today the label of complex, prestige, any of that. We'll just stick to complex TV. There's a reason for that, as opposed to looking outwardly with the labels. I'm kind of bringing it in introspectively into the show itself. And I call my way of doing this layered complexity. So the concept of layered complexity sits alongside other theories concerning representation. So I'm not trying to override anything. I'm not trying to present an alternative. A lot of the literature, as everybody will be well aware, that deals with identity and representation is fragmented anyway. So it will look at race, it will look at gender, it will look at sexuality. This model the concept is designed to kind of allow a method of reading that representation, regardless of what you want to look at through serial narratives. So it's an original framework that can be applied to the shows that are characterised by inbuilt complexity, and all of the books that Anthony discussed, they all acknowledge that these sort of shows have an inbuilt complexity, so different layers that kind of establishes the narratives that you follow through from start to finish, and I'll deal with the factors in a minute. I don't explore external factors either, so like whereas Mattel's work looks out to technologies, it looks out to paratexts, that kind of thing, I have kind of returned it back to the text itself, so it returns to the issues of content, context and culture that Mattel sought to move past. Ultimately, layered complexity refers to the intricately woven tapestry that constitutes the televisual text, which in turn provides a method of reading representations within that text. So it facilitates the identification of shifting archetypal boundaries and borders through the characters that challenge established social and cultural hierarchies. In the shows that I've looked at, not every character conforms to that. There are still some stereotypical characters in there. There are still very simplistic characters that do not have the level of depth to be able to read their representation. But the shows that I've looked at all have several characters that do have that depth, so this can be applied to them. While my research currently focuses on the representation of women on screen, the layered complexity framework isn't limited to gender, as I've said, but focuses on the individual character themselves and the intersecting factors that contribute to their identity. And it does so through these 4 elements. So first of all, we have story world, the dimensions. First of all, story world, then seriality, then narrative, then intertwined arcs. So taking the story world first, that underpins the televisual text, it functions as a mechanism for constructing complexity in and of itself. So it continually expands beyond the borders of the established narrative to that point. It takes different places, provides a different social or cultural context, maybe a historical context through the use of flashbacks, through the discourses that are seen on screen itself. And these all interact with elements that extend beyond the given moment on screen. So the narrative landscape enjoys the possibilities for both continuity and radical departure from what has gone before. This reciprocity is pivotal for challenging the parameters of existing archetypes. So similarly, the scope and the scale of story world is conducive to producing a depth of representation that's better equipped to deal with complex and nuanced identities that exist in the modern world and are more of a concern through public discourses. As such, it can produce multifaceted and nuanced individuals that don't adhere to established binaries and instead adopt traits, behaviour and aesthetic features that step outside of those binaries. And again, that can kind of produce discourses that are more inclusive, foster difference and produce nuanced identities. Seriality also contributes to the layered complexity of the televisual text through the stretching of the text itself. So not necessarily in a conventional way that seriality sort of operates, which was what Anthony was talking about before, but the development of the plot that stretches across accumulated hours, and variations, motifs and patterns that are produced within that. They all feed into representational strategies and paradigms. So in looking to the text itself, rather than beyond it, it's possible to see how seriality adds depth and unleashes possibilities that impact on representation. Long-form seriality ensures that the stories do stretch across multiple seasons. So you'll see characters that are in sort of a 10 episode season, 8 to 10 episode seasons, and they will build and develop from sort of the first time we see them right through till the last one, and they develop nuance and complexity through that. Narrative is a further factor that contributes to the layered complexity, or rather helps to shape how it manifests in the televisual text. So benefiting from the seriality of the show, there are often shifting and parallel narrative arcs that intersect and interact, so that no one storyline is a singular prominent focus. In the complex televisual text, there are several narrative strands ongoing at any given time. And that largely defines a lot of the text that I'm kind of looking at in terms of representation. They all vary in prominence as well, and important to the show's direction, so it can go off on various tangents. Some characters might disappear for a few episodes and then return, or they may be prominent throughout. But it stretches the character development. And here, they interact through shared characters and geographical locations as well. So both forms of this linkage facilitate the switching of narrative priorities and enable the exploration of multiple archetypes simultaneously because of the lack of a singular focus. In some of the texts, the narratives allow for multiple iterations of the same type, which is unusual, or has been before this kind of era of television. And finally, to the deeply intertwined development arcs that contribute to the larger textual fabric of the show. So that lends a depth as well as an expansive narratological landscape. You have narrative arcs, which kind of allows them to sort of physically travel through the text. Character arcs, so that's development. world building arcs, so how they interact with the world around them, how that contributes to the narrative, and the bigger kind of story world that's within the show, and then thematic arcs as well. They all sort of contribute to the representational identities of the individuals, and you can see it in various different shows. So I'd originally planned to apply it to Game of Thrones and to Babylon Berlin here. Game of Thrones was my thesis, so it makes sense to do that. But time constraints have unfortunately meant I haven't actually got through Babylon Berlin yet, so I won't be talking about that today. But I have formulated and tested it through a range of different shows. So obviously The Wire, that was one of the first shows that showed the kind of narrative complexity that is required for the reading representation through layer complexity. Game of Thrones, The Last Kingdom, which is an interesting case study because obviously that was on the BBC to begin with, and shifted focus when it moved to Netflix in 2018 for its third season. The first two seasons are largely focused on a single protagonist, whereas the ensuing seasons kind of split it amongst different protagonists, although Uhtred is a focus. So that builds up the layer complexity following the move from the BBC to Netflix. This Is Us, obviously following the different characters through their lives with flashbacks, with memories, how they interact with each other. Stranger Things, also quite that's quite clever with its layer complexity. Babylon Berlin, The Umbrella Academy, again different kind of settings, movements with time, spatial, and temporal elements contribute to that. The Witcher and The Last of Us as two adaptations from video games, novels, that kind of thing. A lot of these are also grounded in novels, so that gives them an advantage, shall we say, in terms of how the story world is constructed, so, and how the televisual text contributes to that. So this is somewhat more simplified than I'd like, but obviously reducing 300 pages down to a single presentation is difficult. But I'd like to look at Arya Stark because she's obviously in Game of Thrones from the first episode to the very last episode, and she is arguably one of the, if not the character, that undergoes the most significant transition. So it's kind of easier to read her representation through layer complexity than it would be another character that does evolve, but the evolution isn't so obvious necessarily. So again, sort of explaining it in a 20-minute presentation will be difficult. So she is classified as a warrior woman. Well, that's how I classify her. The story world contributes to her development by being expansive in and of itself. So it accommodates all the phases of her development, from girlhood right through to becoming a very, very capable adult who is independent. She sails off into the sunset at the end, and sorry about spoilers. And she develops the most from the extent of the story world she can kind of traverse across. It allows her to evade patriarchal control because she skirts along the edges of society. And as she moves and pushes the boundaries of the story world, her representation then kind of moves beyond the binaries and borders of the traditional warrior woman. In terms of seriality, again, she develops from a child longing for adventure in the first episode into a capable assassin. It's only logically possible through the time and space that seriality offers. So she goes from the first episode, she's fighting, refuses point blank to just marry and settle down as a lady of a great house. Turns around to her father and tells him that's not me, when he indicates that will be her future. She then goes through the show and proves it. So she goes off and trains under various different characters, in various different locations, learning the different skills that then contribute to her characterisation at the end. I would happily talk about her narrative arc actually for the 20 minutes without talking about anything else, because it's epic. She intersects with multiple characters who influence her development and empower her to push the boundaries of what is possible for a warrior woman. As you can see by the pictures, she's not of the typical stature of a warrior woman, so she has to work at it to develop the skills. She fights in a different way, she looks a different way. But it's through her interaction with characters like the Hound, who acts as kind of a pseudo father figure, through Jack and Hagar, who takes her in to become no one, and teaches her how to be a faceless man or an assassin. They all contribute something to her characterisation, but it's what she takes from them that is important for her identity and that contributes to the way she appears at the end. Particularly as in the last season, she changes personas depending on who she is speaking to. So that's another complicating factor for her character development that is made possible through the narrative, because you can see where each of these identities has come from and how they fit together in her characterisation as well. In terms of intersecting arcs, her physical journey through the text contributes to a rich character arc through experience, but the same thematic arcs remain there all the time. So she's seeking revenge for her father's death, she's trying to survive. The line that I've said, "That's not me," she says it in the first season, she says it in the last season. And it becomes kind of a repetitive sort of mantra that, despite how she evolves through the text, kind of frames that evolution, and it keeps her grounded in who she actually is. And also independent, she always strives for independence. These are all traits, they're all thematic elements, but they contribute to her ongoing traits as she develops as a person. So we're able to read her through how she flaunts gender, typical gender roles in that show. We can read her through the development of her identity in terms of there is an element of sexuality to it as well, that kind of, well, is typical of the last season, let's face it. But you're kind of able to read her through the archetypal warrior woman, who is strong, who is brave, looks a lot like Brienne, actually. But she's the antithesis of that, and yet still a credible warrior woman because she pushes the boundaries and the binaries of her identity. And not only that, because they are alongside each other, it shows the representational possibilities of that archetype within the same show, as opposed to just sticking to either one of them. Okay, there are limitations and exceptions that I'm kind of working through still at the minute, so it's not all encompassing. It can't be applied across all genres, formats and platforms because it is limited to complex shows, which again is subjective in and of itself. There is a problematic application to terrestrial television. Like we were talking the Waterloo Road thing earlier, because it's kind of confined to one location. The story world's kind of set. And terrestrial television doesn't tend to have that inbuilt level of complexity that HBO shows do, for example, or Netflix to a degree as well. There are anomalies within a televisual text where characters are not developed through creative choice. So in Game of Thrones, we have the sex workers. In Stranger Things, Argyle, the stone surfer dude, he's not developed beyond sort of that figure for that part of the narrative, because he provides a comedic interlude as much as anything else. Archetype and paradigm labels still apply, so it's how comfortable you are really categorising characters in a certain way. I'm comfortable with using the label warrior women, for example, because although Arya sort of pushes the boundaries of that archetype, her identity is still very much grounded in it. And that's what she wants to be as well. She identifies as a warrior. And again, some texts exhibit partial adherence. So you've got Grey's Anatomy, for example. It's possible to read types through that, for example, mother, intellectual woman, various different representational figures there. But it was very much Meredith-centric through the first few seasons. So like she was the main character instead of having intersecting stories that kind of developed to a far greater extent later on. So yeah, it's there's a lot of there are examples like that, and again the YouTube one that I said earlier for The Last Kingdom, it kind of developed that complexity when it shifted away from the BBC as opposed to being on it. And just some notes on impact really. So layered complexity built on previous developments in television. It didn't begin with Game of Thrones or other similar 21st century shows. You can see various elements of complexity in other genres. Soap, for example, there are elements of it there, although it's not fully developed. It does, however, highlight the importance of nuanced representation on television through insights into inbuilt narrative complexity on screen, particularly by the depth and range of characters that are visible on screen. So now there are far more character types, far more elements that contribute to nuanced identities, for modern identities that were not necessarily there sort of a few decades ago. It can be applied in conjunction with existing theories and frameworks, but provides a means of reading representation of multiple archetypes simultaneously, and then multiple types of archetypes too. And finally, just to say, the framework does have the potential to evolve alongside the medium. So when complex shows develop further, you know, looking at other ideas of concerning the characters that are presented, and also discourses that are centred on identity and representation as well. Thank you.
I've got a comment for the question. Louise, I would really take that model and apply it to trans characters. And I feel like you also be with my thing tomorrow, which is about reading trans characters. So yeah, that'd be great. And Anthony, just taking out one example from the examples that you provided. The Mandalorian, I thought it was significant that you picked out season 2, which does conform to that structure of every episode is like a different genre, and I think it benefited from that. It was so engaging. But in season 1, it does not have that quality, and in season 3, it definitely lost that quality, like that episodicity now. Like it sort of returned to sort of an A plot, B plot structure. And I'm just wondering, like, with that fluctuation across the sort of spectrum of episodicity and narrative properties as you've laid them out, what kind of meanings surround that fluctuation?
Well, first, I totally agree. Like a show like, whether it be The Mandalorian, How to Get Away with Murder, Scandal, I think the different markers of episodicity can fluctuate and change. Just with The Mandalorian, I mean, I would say that'd be at the high end of something of being episodic storytelling, just chiefly for its frequent use of standalone stories. But I guess, yeah, the framework I'm presenting, it doesn't need the programs to be stable. If you were to rate The Mandalorian's degree of episodicity that it attains, you would consider, well, season 1 not so much, season 2 perhaps more so, and season 3 definitely not. That might be your analysis of it, and that would be fine. So, but I definitely agree that that's, if you take any program, particularly if it's running for multiple seasons, could see a different approach to both what I'm trying to reclaim as episodic storytelling and also serial storytelling, you know, over the years.
So meanings could be generated from that kind of analysis of the fluctuation. That's what I'm kind of getting from it. So.
Like interpreting.
Yeah.
Well, I guess
like plotting, writing, you know, audience interpretation, things like that. I think it, like using the model could lead to that kind of.
Yes, I would certainly, to take your example of Mandalorian again, I'd be interested to see how we can both analyse it textually. I'd be interested to see how that's culturally constructed as well. So how the narrative is activated culturally, and I imagine it would be somewhere along the lines you suggested. But you know, I think that would be an interesting area of study. This paper's kind of like old-fashioned structuralist, as well as trying to consider cultural context as well. So I wouldn't want to jump to too many assumptions and claims around the meanings that I would interpret.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Beth. I really enjoyed both papers. Both kind of, I think it's a question for both of you. So there was a tweet a couple, one of those tweets that went viral that really hit me where I live, and it was like, oh, I'm loving Disney Plus's new weekly drop format for the Marvel series, and I was just like, and it was just the kind of oh, your conception of TV is just totally different to mine. But then I started thinking okay, so is this now how we're kind of visualizing prestige TV? It has this quote unquote weekly drop format, because if we think about Game of Thrones, that was kind of that was prestige TV, that was big budget, big TV. And then House of Cards came along and changed it, and it was now prestige TV comes all in one drop on a series. And now I think we're kind of, are we swinging back to that idea of so I guess what I'm asking is, because the Marvel series particularly, they were individual episodes, but they were very much part of an overarching series structure. But does that weekly drop format contribute to episodicity? And if so, is that now a kind of indicator of prestige, or quality, I guess?
Can I answer the weekly, just on the weekly drop issue? Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's super relevant. We was actually talking about it, a few of us at the end of this morning's panel. I mean, I was reading Amanda Lotz's book on Netflix recently, and one of the first points she puts is Netflix is not all streaming services, and I think a lot of literature in the teens or 2010s, there's kind of conflation going on there. And what I would say is one of Netflix's USP was, we're going to put this original season out, all episodes at once, and yes, there was kind of, wow, House of Cards, Orange is the New Black, this is amazing, this is the future. But other services thought, well, hang on, we're burning cultural capital here by dumping it all in 1 week, and then everyone's talking about it next week. And I mean, other institutional economic reasons. If you look now at Disney Plus, Apple TV Plus, Amazon, Max, and as a conduit for HBO, which is still also on cable in America, yeah, I mean, they've obviously settled on the weekly drop as the smartest thing for them to do. And I do think it contributes to the episodicity, because everyone watches that one episode, everyone's on social media talking about that one episode, that becomes the cultural conversation comes around that one episode, so I don't think it contributes to it. Just an aside, and I think this was something we talked about as well, but it's interesting to see that some narratives are they're more built for binge watching. I was talking about the last season of Succession, and no spoilers, but it's meant to take about cover the space of 10 days, I believe, or maybe even fewer days, something like 8 days. But when you're watching that over the space of 10 weeks, it does not feel like, and you're like, again, no spoilers, but at some point you think, that corpse has been hanging around for a long time. So, I mean, I think, but that's not, it doesn't really answer your question. But so, yes, and so I think a lot of the hype around. I mean, that was part of the way networks positioned themselves. This is what we're doing to think with revolutionising television. I don't think it has revolutionised television drama. And some of the most buzzy shows, Succession, White Lotus, Last of Us, House of the Dragon, all HBO, it's all still on weekly drama.
Yeah, it's enduring.
That's really, it works for a reason. I'm sorry, I'm hopping this up. But there was something, Kirsten Thompson, is that right? Orwell and Thompson? Kristen Thompson. Kristen Thompson, she wrote like the early 2000s about American television drama. And she was about its narrative. And she made the point that a lot of the storytelling practices that are born out of commercial concerns to feed a commercial television model, yes, they're born of those institutional concerns, but actually they do contribute to some good storytelling. So we shouldn't assume that just because a new platform comes in that we're suddenly going to forget all those great ways of telling stories. Sorry.
I think that, the shows that I've used and looked at so far, some are sort of dropping all at once, but most aren't. Most kind of HBO, even The Witcher, this season is split into two. Instead of sort of all dropping at once. And I think that kind of aids the reading of representation, because I'd have to look further into sort of the processes of binge watching and all that kind of thing. But I think with it dropping weekly, it allows people to engage with the characters, to kind of digest their role in the story, the narrative as it's going on. Particularly with Thrones, a lot of the engagement surrounding it, and The Last of Us and Stranger Things, I think, although that's obviously not, that dropped, well, no it didn't, did it? The last one did drop in 2 lots, Stranger Things. But I think, particularly with the HBO seasons, the discussion that occurs online, the debates over whether Jon Snow's going to live or not or whatever, that certainly sort of contributes to the dialogue surrounding the characters and sort of how they develop, where they develop, even the criticisms of the last season where they completely forgot character, for Cersei in particular, which really and sort of went for aesthetic, spectacular over that. The ability to kind of discuss it, to digest it, to think about it, to make assumptions in certain cases of where it's going to go next definitely helps with engagement and the ability to read sort of the nuance in the character. Whereas I feel that, for me anyway, it might be different for other people, I think if it drops all at once and you kind of binge watch it, I do miss a lot of the nuance the first time round and have to go back and kind of pick it up the second time. And that's, with the narratives being so complex, I think that's a danger for the representation element of it if it's kind of all dropped at once, as opposed to, which is, I've picked up more in the last kind of watch through of Stranger Things, because I had to watch it the first lot again before I went to watch the second lot. But yeah, I do think that sort of the weekly drop kind of helps in that respect, as opposed to dropping it all at once.
Thank you. Yeah, last question, I'm afraid. So, Laura.
Yeah, thank you both. Fascinating papers. Louise, I'm really interested in your idea of layered complexity. I wondered if you probably have written about this, but is it based around budget as well? What is feasibly possible on screen in terms of those narrative worlds and what we get to see?
Yeah, I think a lot of the shows that exhibit that complexity are kind of a big budget, which is why, as far as I can tell so far, that it kind of separates HBO, Netflix, that kind of thing, from terrestrial TV. Because, like Peaky Blinders, for example, at first glance it would appear to kind of fit into it, but then when I went back and revisited it, it doesn't. Just because I think it's so sort of anchored to the historical context that sometimes it kind of prioritises that over the development of the actual characters in it. I don't think they meant to do that. It's just kind of the way it happened. So certainly in terms of, again, The Last Kingdom is a really good example of that. So it didn't have that level of complexity, despite being based on sort of a book series as well, adapted from Bernard Cornwell's books. It didn't have the same level of complexity and depth that it did when it went to Netflix. And I'm certain a lot of that is to do with the budget and the ability to kind of give those characters room to breathe and space to develop. Particularly as the creative choice to kind of foreground characters like Breeder, who were relegated to sort of secondary, very much a secondary character, like almost one that wasn't really considered. Whether that's to do with genre and kind of looking at the male characters more, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, I do think that budget does make a massive difference in terms of like allowing the characters to kind of breathe.
Do you think it's possible without that budget?
I don't know. That's an interesting question, actually. It probably is if they sort of ran with the narrative element of it a bit more and kind of pushed the story world back using techniques like flashback, like memory, like, I mean, discourse. Game of Thrones, for example, uses letters to expand the parameters of the story world further. Techniques like that, so it would be possible, but I don't necessarily think they'd choose to do it.
Okay, interesting.
But it's something to look into, definitely.
Sorry, we've actually run out of time. Yeah, can we thank the speakers again? We have half an hour break now, and then 2 more panels, and then those people who have looked for dinner, if you want to walk there together, it's not very far, and it's basically along the main road. It's a little cut on the left-hand side. But if you want to walk there together, I would suggest that we meet 6:45 in front of the main building. Yeah? The main building's obviously the old brick one, yeah?
Yeah, no,